Hello, welcome friends. My name is Tanbir Ratsi, I'm an art historian, and today we'll be talking about Indian modern art between 1920s. We already discussed the advent of modernism in India. We have talked about artists like Abanindranath Tagore, Raja Ravi Verma. We have also spoken briefly about the developments that shaped up during the colonial rule that played instrumental roles in establishing the foundations of modern art in India. Now these 2 decades, the period between 1920s to 1940s, becomes crucial to India because, as we discussed in previous modules, many significant developments, including the establishment of several art schools, including the establishment of several art societies, and also the British Empire had started loosening its grip on India. It was also the time when artists, intellectuals of the country were seriously concerned about defining their identity on the international cultural map of the world. An identity which could define Indian ethos, but at the same time would not remain alien to the world cultural practices. So here, let me quickly take you through the developments of these 2 decades, the developments that shaped between 1920 to 1940s. Let's concentrate on the backdrop and let's position ourselves, our historical analysis, our historical reading of the paintings against a historical backdrop that will help us to construct a narrative, to understand the contours, to understand the complexities of the art historical narrative in India. As I said, these 2 decades between 1920 to 1940 were crucial to India in terms of its socio-political atmosphere, in terms of many executions that took place, in terms of establishing a new vocabulary of Indian art. At the same time, important because of the advent of Bawa School's exhibition in Kolkata in 1924. Obviously, the epicenter still for many activities that included cultural, social, political, as well as artistic to a larger extent, was Calcutta. So in Calcutta, the dominant family, the family of the Tagores, was a key factor. The family of the Tagores played extremely significant role in making Bengal a cosmopolitan center for the arts, where they invited intellectuals from across the countries, where they invited intellectuals from abroad, such as Stella Cramrich from Oxford to teach art history at Shantiniketan. Ananda Kumar Swami lived for a long time in Jorashanko in India with Tagores, writing and deliberating and discoursing on Indian art. Sister Nivedita, one of the essential proponents of Indian art, was also a part of this collective that was formed around, in and around Jorashanko House of Tagores. There were many others, like E.B. Hebel. We have been repeating this name for a very long time now in previous modules. Kokazo Okakora and others who had a deep interest in the Indian traditions of art, in the Indian aesthetic values of art, and they played a key role in establishing the curriculums, encouraging students as well as teachers and the professional artists to look back at the traditional Indian art and derive inspiration from there instead of going out directly to the Western notions of art. Against this backdrop, let's have a look, an overview or a bird's eye view of these 2 decades and see what actually was cooking up and how did it ultimately turn out to be. The contribution of Rabindranath Tagore and the revival of Indian tradition, which was already discussed in the previous modules, and we'll not go into that. With his admirers, as I said, E.B. Hewell, Sister Nivedita and others had founded Indian Society of Oriental Art in 1907 to promote indigenous style. The Indian Society of Oriental Art was not limited to the artists and intellectuals of India, within India only. It comprised of many others, including people from Japan like Kokazuo Kokora and 2 other artists who will come to later, who were conscious of their identity and attempted to present it, to project it, to represent their ethos on the world cultural map. But the society, as I said, played a dynamic role promoting Indian as well as Asian art, which included Japan and China together. Now, let's pause here for a while. And let me tell you that this was also the time when Japan was recently freed from Japan and China were also suffering from the same identity crisis, from the same concerns that India had. Both Indian as well as Japanese and Chinese artists and intellectuals, people who were attached to the cultural affair of Asia, were coming forward to understand, were coming forward to deliberate the idea of nativity, the idea of indigeneity. Similar to India, art in Japan and China, a distinct indigenous flavor which appeared alien to British, which appeared alien to other European artistic traditions. By 1920, 2 influential political figures, Aurobindo Ghosh and Annie Besant, redefined the spirituality of Indian art. These figures were instrumental, these figures played roles, key roles, in defining the spiritualism of India. Then comes the Theosophical Society, which promotes the Theosophy and talks about the Indian spiritualism in 1920s. During the same decade, the freedom struggle movement against colonial rule and Swadeshi movement for the first time merged together. They came together with the cultural renaissance, merged together with an endeavor to form or to trigger or to ignite a sense of cultural renaissance in order to define the cultural identity of India. Artists like Raja Ravi Verma and many others had already painted Indian mythological scenes in British academic style. And this has given a certain direction to the Indian art. His oleographs of historical figures, and heroes in the direction of indigenous and national art had provided some kind of a ray of light under which one could see the glorious past of India, the rich artistic as well as mythological and spiritual heritage of India, which was otherwise completely ignored by the colonizers. His oleographs drew the attention of Rabindra and Abhinendranath Tagore together. Now he set up a press, and oleographs is something that you publish, you print, you make a painting. Then in order to make a variety of copies of the same painting, where you don't consume a lot of time, oleography was a technique, like we have a technique of printing varieties of copies of printing, copies of a painting or copies of a photograph. Similarly, oleograph was a technique. Ravi Verma had purchased a press in Bombay where he had established the printing of oleographs of his works, famous mythological works, with an endeavor to reach out to the common. Ravi Verma had bought a press in Mumbai, that time Bombay, to produce copies of his paintings in oleographs. Quite similar to what we do with photographs today, because the iconic image that Ravi Verma painted were extremely popular. He took advantage of this popularity and thought of reaching to the common public, to the people who couldn't afford his original painting, which of course was very costly that time. Privilege of a very few who could afford it. The oleographs of Ravi Verma printed in the press were sold in cheap rates to the common public. Abhinendranath was, of course, in search of a new style, an alternative that could respond to the European style or British academic art, not in the way by imitating from their paintings and their artistic traditions, but something which could be placed parallel, at the same time could be deemed as alternative artistic language. And he was not impressed, of course, by Ravi Verma's approach of painting at all. He was more inspired by the Indian tradition of Mughal paintings and Rajput paintings. That's why when you see his paintings, his early phase, say for example, if you look at your screen, where he has actually derived inspiration from a Mughal painting where Shah Jahan is dying, or Shah Jahan is on his deathbed. Yeah, very interesting thing and a sad story about this painting, that it is said that Abhinendranath's own daughter had died before he painted this painting. And scholars and art historians have done considerable amounts of reading to identify the grief, the pain, the yearning, the longing, the separation in this painting. But what is interesting, not only this, but the stylistic approach, the stylistic similarity is pretty evident. Even few of those, even some of us who might not have seen the original painting by Abhinendranath Tagore, or for that matter, if we must have seen many Mughal miniatures or Rajput miniatures, we could easily identify that this is a direct representation of a style that the artist was inspired by. His interest lied particularly in the architectural representation and representations of landscapes in the Mughal and the Rajput paintings. His contact with the Japanese scholar Kokazo Okakura and two other Japanese artists, Yokoyama Taikun and Hishida Shunro, helped him closely observe Japanese mannerisms, resulted into wash method. And it is from these two artists that he learned the famous wash painting, which was then and still continues to be associated with Calcutta School and Shantiniketan. During 1930 to 33, he painted Arabian Nights, a series in watercolor wash technique representing various episodes happening in various places in a single picture. What we need to consider here, not only was the stylistic representation very important for Rabindranath and Abhinendranath Tagore, people who didn't believe in the Eurocentric notions, or perhaps thought to produce an alternative, an answer to European academic realism. The subject matter was of a similar concern. It was of the same importance. Deriving directly from the mythology of India, Abhinendranath Tagore, unlike Ravi Verma, went a step further. Instead of considering pan-Indian subjects, he took into account the pan-Asian subjects and depicted Arabian Nights. This was also an approach. This thinking was embedded in his thought process that was craving, that was yearning, and that was time and again propelling and compelling him to find an alternative to European art. He placed these stories in Calcutta. So a welcome gesture also, a reflective gesture that Arabian Nights, as the writer of the Arabian Nights is anonymous. The freedom with the narrative is that it's a fairy land. The lands are not defined in Arabian Nights, though there are some glimpses that could be recovered. But to a common reader, they are not defined immediately. So you can place them anywhere. Sindbad could be placed anywhere, Aladdin could be placed anywhere, Genie could be placed anywhere, and other characters, you can adopt them, imagine them, and that's what Abhinendranath Tagore was doing through his paintings. He placed them in the old residencies of Kolkata and the house of Tagore's. Abhinendranath's talented students such as Nandalal Bose, Asit Kumar Haldar, Shitendranath Majumdar, Surendranath Ganguly, Shailendranath Dey, K. Venkatappa, Surendranath Gupta, etc. learned this style. But they didn't just stick to it. They extended their master's style and developed their own individual styles. They spread the wash technique during the tenure in various major art institutions across the country, making it popular as something they had learned from their master, and because of which it was labeled as a technique that essentially was invented in Kolkata, that time Calcutta, and then spread across country. All these Bengal school artists earned their reputation as nationalist painters. But some of them, it could be disputed that they were not essentially nationalists in their styles or subject matters. But this is because of their deep engagement with the cultural expressions and signified sense of nationalism. Now, let's turn our attention towards the emergence of modern thought. We've been already discussing a lot about modernism and all these narratives, the threads that I'm trying to pull together here and create a web of it. I know it might sound complex often to you, but I will try my level best to make it as lucid as I could. In order to give you an idea, and in order to ignite your interest, to go further into the realm of history and art history of India, to recover more threads and connect them and reconnect them and form your own idea of modernity or modernism in India, especially in terms of visual arts. Rabindranath Tagore had doubts about Bengal school's openness and wanted to widen the artistic perspective. Many others, as we discussed in Calcutta during that time, also expressed doubts about the revivalistic idea, the idea of revivalism, because they thought it restricts, it strains artistic creativity. He found an immediate reflection in Gaganendranath, who noticed alongside Rabindranath the gradual freezing of Bengal school due to particular mannerisms. Now, when you invent a style, as I was talking about the parabolic order of Winckelmann, the German historian, art historian, one has to consider the restrictions there always are. With every medium you work in, whether oil or acrylic, watercolor or some other medium, or the mannerism that you create. That's why we see a variety of styles right from the inception of art in this world, that man and man's creativity has always thought, had always yearned, has always craved for something new. And to create this something new, one always tries to identify the faults, the limitations of what is prevalent, of what is existent. This was something that ignited, and this was the reason that Rabindranath's revivalism sounded a little restrictive to Rabindranath and Gaganendranath Tagore. Rabindranath was very open to welcome cross-cultural adaptation, or in concurrent terms, or in contemporary terms, we can term them as cosmopolitan mentality. Rabindranath was very open to welcome cross-cultural adaptation, and he began to imagine internationalism by intermingling or putting together or joining together of East and West. In current terms, we can term this approach as cosmopolitan approach. He was very open to the idea of merging of the two traditions. He was interested in the intersection of cultures, a cross-cultural adaptation that he proposed both in education as well as in other spheres of life, was something that he held very close to his heart. To do this, practically materialize this, as we all know that he traveled almost across the world. He was a famous personality, wore many hats, and one of the hats that we are interested in is the hat of an artist. He invited people from outside, and one of the major figures important to Indian art history is Stella Cramrich, the art historian from Oxford. She was invited by Rabindranath Tagore to teach art history and study the Indian art at Shantiniketan. European modern art made its way to India practically earlier. It was practically European modern art practically, physically made its way in India in 1920s. Earlier, people had seen images of Picasso, images of Matisse, images of Cézanne, impressionistic images in magazines and periodicals that were supplied from Europe to India. But in 1920s, with the help of Rabindranath Tagore, Calcutta saw something very significant, something it hadn't yet seen, something that was going to create a considerable impact on the artist's mentality. It was the exhibition of Part-1. European modern art practically entered India in 1920s, a time when Rabindranath Tagore organized an exhibition of Bahuvas, which included the works of Kandinsky and Paul Klee. The mounting of this exhibition proved a milestone in the history of Indian art. Firstly, it challenged and almost dismantled the notions of Victorian naturalism in India that was being propagated by British. But what it also did, that it paved a new way for the non-representational art, as we know that Vasily Kandinsky and Paul Klee essentially painted in abstract or semi-abstract ways. But this was not the only, but before this, Indians had seen, Indians had known, Indians had read about Western art, Western modern art, from journals like Rupam, Sukumar Roy, an author of Bengali journal Prabhashi, had written about Brancusi in 1914. Roy's essay titled Exaggerations in Art acknowledged Cubism as a challenge to academic naturalism, at the same time rejecting extreme distortion in Picasso's and Brock's paintings. Another scholar from Bengal, Ornendra C. Ganguly, editor of Rupam, claimed that Indians were aware of recent developments of modern Western art. At the same time, he recalled his encounter with the Polynesian sculptures and masks from New Guinea, which he related with Picasso and Matisse. In a sense, this gives us an idea that India was not unaware of the world developments and the discourses on art, but it certainly had not seen in person, the artists of India had not seen yet the works of the artists, excluding Rabindranath Tagore because he used to travel internationally. That's why Bahua's art exhibition in Calcutta in 1920s becomes an essential landmark, as I said, to pave way for a new kind of thinking to emerge, encouraging those who think beyond representation, who think beyond figures and proper anatomical structures, who believed in more abstraction, who believed in a representational way that necessarily could not be identified, that could be mysterious, that could be absurd. The modern Western artists and Orientalists were different in approach but sharing a common plateau against academic art. In the West, as well as in Asia, people had already, like in Rabindranath Tagore, we find the first rebel who almost discarded Ravi Verma's approach of imitating Victorian naturalism. Modern art in Europe, especially in France and America, had also rebelled against the representation, the proper anatomical representation, or the European naturalism that we saw in Impressionism and Post-Impressionism and the movements that followed it. Now let's turn to the artistic aura between 1920s and 1940s. What actually was happening in the field of arts? What were the concerns that were being discussed? What were the ideas that were being exchanged? What was the need that was felt by the artists and art enthusiasts? What were the challenges that were being dealt with? What conceptual grounds were actually attempted? What conceptual grounds were actually formed by the artists and the scholars? Rabindranath Tagore and Gaganendranath Tagore realized, as I said, the stiffness of Bengal school and the restrictedness of it, and kept themselves away from their mannerism. See, this is also happening now. One can also talk about at length that how open-ended Indian art discourse and Indian arts practice during these 2 decades was. that this is happening in the same premises of Jorashanko House in Shantiniketan. But at the same time, one of the family members, who is dubbed as the first modernist painter in India, has gone to every extent to propose the idea of revivalism, both practically as well as theoretically, that we see in Abanindranath Tagore. But at the same time, a poet, painter, a philosopher, a visionary, an educationist like Tagore is finding it hard to come to terms with the idea of revival. So is the young Gaganindranath Tagore, who developed his own style of cubism, which was deeply influenced by Picasso and Bloch. In 1922, Rupam magazine, now bear in mind here that the discourse and the practice are speaking to each other closely, which we often see missing in Indian art history. The Rupam reproduced Gaganindranath's cubistic series with Stella Kramrich's article titled An Indian Cubist. Gaganindranath had interpreted and rendered the real objects in a dramatic play of light and shadows with imagined intersections of planes and tonal variations. According to Kramrich, Gaganindranath's compositions inclined to set up a conflict between the light and colors of Indian art and geometric rationality of Cubism. Now again, when Kramrich is talking about Gaganindra's work, she's also referring to the idea of Indian and Western blend of idioms, which was floated around, as I said previously, by Tagore, and had found its admirer in the young Gaganindranath. As an individualist, Stella puts it, he was no more interested in painterly historicism. The historicism that Abanindranath Tagore, his predecessor, was a sound proponent of. His involvement with set designs, which he designed for Rabindranath's plays, staged in their home, Jorashanko, as I mentioned previously, nurtured his vision towards artificial lights, imaginary interiors, crisscross light and shadows. All this drama, a fine tonality, the grasp over colors, and also the compositional mastery was at work in Gaganindranath's works. His preoccupation into Bengali stage and literature evoked him to create depths in planes such as half-open doors, pillars, backdrops, staircases, or the entry and exit points for the artist on stage. It's also said that he used to place crystal against the light in order to capture rainbow colors on the paper, and finally possessed a kaleidoscope to break objects into a variety of geometric shapes in order to achieve the perfect dimension, the perfect division in his compositions. In 1920s, Gaganindranath was engaged in his modern experiments. He created fairy tale, a world of fairy tales, a world which was filled with mysticism, a world which was filled with mysteriousness, without the actual tales, and kept them hidden by ambiguous rituals of artificial light and dark shadows. Though Gaganindranath devised Cubism in his own context, his revolutionary language gave a new energy in the art scene in Bengal, which continued for for a long time and made considerable impact on the minds of other artists. Now, if we look at Rabindranath Tagore, a polymath in the strictest sense of the word, who wrote poetry, short stories, composed museum, staged dramas, wrote plays, directed them as well, a creative modernist and also an instrumental figure, as I said previously, in organizing the show of Bahwas. He also, as I said previously, had imagined the cross-cultural adaptation during his tours of Europe, America, and Japan. An extensive traveler by nature and a visionary, Rabindranath Tagore's eye did not escape the developments that were shaping up in Europe, America, and Japan. And he was inclined to a more cosmopolitan approach of art and education in India. In 1920s, Bahwa's exhibition and Stella Kramrich's art history teaching in Shantiniketan were the formative years of Rabindranath's emergence as an artist. He identified the limitations of Bengal school and wanted to break free from the conventional practice of revivalism, both in terms of technique and in terms of expression. In the beginning, he developed a practice of doodling on the corrected pages of his manuscripts of poetry, stories, dramas, and literature and philosophy that he was engaged in. His exposure to various art traditions presented him the role of imagination and spontaneity as alternative for the representative skills. Again, when Rabindranath Tagore, Kokazor Kokora, and E.B. Hebel laid stress on reviving the stylistic similarities of Indian Oriental art, Rabindranath was looking for a language that is more international. Training of the land is one thing, guidance by the spirit another. The work of Rabindranath Tagore, singularly free from conventions and schooling, is subject to a discipline of its own. Rabindranath's works were the result of imagination. His wide range of experiences cutting across all fields of cultural practice and cross-cultural expressions by scribbling or doodling with pen and ink, and brushworks with black ink on ordinary papers. Most of the times, as I said, on the corrected manuscripts of his writing. A shade of expression was also noticed in his work by Kramrich without any stylistic influence, unlike Rabindranath, unlike Abhinendranath and Gaganendranath. The former, who was more inclined to Indian way of presenting art, and Gaganendranath, who was inclined towards a cubistic way of expressing his ideas, Rabindranath was more interested in the expression and not in the style. Dark imagery of landscapes, doodles, faces, and elements of strangeness fills romantic sensitivity in his work. At the same time, they're deeply emotional. He never tried to impress the onlooker. I think that was the lifeblood of his work. That was the essential factor of his work, that he didn't have the viewer in the mind. His predecessors as artists, Abhinendranath and Gaganendranath, perhaps had viewers in their minds when they talked about a particular language of art, a particular style of art, a particular idiom of art, a particular subject matters in their paintings. This was not a foundation for Rabindranath, who freely did whatever came to his mind, doodled around, created drawings without bearing in mind what ultimately they will result in. That is to say, without taking into consideration a particular stylistic representation that ultimately would have become identified, that particularly would have helped the audience to identify his work in terms of stylistic similarities. No. He was completely out of this ambit of style and tradition. He was freely working on the paper with his medium, never perhaps thinking to restrain himself in terms of the stylistic constraints, in terms of the subject matters. But to mention here, he obviously was concerned about the feelings, the emotions that were internalized. He was interested in feelings and emotions of a persona, of an individual, which he expressed in his works.